The night air was thick with humidity as the city of New York hummed with the usual chaos. Sirens blared in the distance, honking cars echoed on every corner, and the hum of neon lights flickered against the street. In the heart of Manhattan, an exclusive penthouse apartment on the top floor of a luxurious building held a darker secret. Santino Tony Russo was a man of immense power, one of the most feared drug lords in the tri-state area. His name alone could silence a room. In the business of narcotics, power was everything. With ruthless determination and a coldness in his eyes that matched the steel buildings of the city, Tony had built an empire from the ground up. He was feared, admired, and, above all, untouchable. But Tony had one weakness. His lover, Brandon Cole, was a stunningly handsome man in his late 20s. Brandon was Tony's secret, hidden away from the world, their affair forbidden by the Mafia's unspoken rules. Tony knew what he stood to lose if anyone found out. Their love was a dangerous game, one that Tony had carefully hidden until one fateful night. Brandon, unable to take the pressure anymore, had made a decision that would shatter their lives. He had contacted Tony's wife, Isabella Russo, sending a message that would change everything. "I'm done hiding. She deserves to know the truth. You're not the man you pretend to be, and I'm not your puppet anymore." Brandon had expected a different reaction from Tony, but what he didn't realize was how deep the betrayal ran. He was about to learn just how far Tony would go to protect his secrets. The phone rang, cutting through the silence of the luxurious apartment. Tony Russo, dressed in a black silk robe, sat at his desk, the shadows from the city lights casting long lines across his face. He picked up the receiver, his fingers gripping it with a sense of unease. "Tony!" Brandon's voice came through the speaker, trembling slightly. "We need to talk. I've made a decision." Tony leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. He knew what was coming. His heart rate quickened, but his voice remained calm. "You've made your decision, huh?" Brandon sighed heavily. "I contacted Isabella. She knows. I told her everything. About us. About what we've been doing behind her back." The words felt like a bullet to Tony's chest. His hand gripped the edge of the desk as his mind raced. "You did what?" Tony's voice dropped to a growl, barely containing the rage building inside him. "I had to, Tony," Brandon replied, his voice shaking. "She deserves the truth. I'm tired of living in the shadows, hiding from everyone. She knows now, and we can't keep this lie going anymore. I'm done." Tony stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "No, you don't get to just end this. You don't control anything here, Brandon. You think you're the one who gets to decide? You think you can just blow everything up and walk away? No, Brandon, you've made a mistake." A long silence hung in the air, but Tony's mind was already working, calculating the next steps. Brandon's voice cut through the quiet once again. "I'm not afraid of you anymore, Tony. I'm not afraid of what you can do. This is bigger than us. I don't care if you're a mafia kingpin. I'm done with you." The line went dead. Tony's heart raced as he slammed the receiver back into its cradle. His breath was shallow, his fists clenched at his sides. There was no turning back now. If Isabella knew, everything would unravel. His empire, his marriage, and most importantly, his reputation. The walls were closing in. Hours later, Tony stood in his penthouse's glass-walled balcony, looking out over the city that had never known the truth about him. His fingers tightened around the railing, his knuckles white. It was a quiet night in the city, but Tony could feel the storm brewing in his mind. He couldn't let Brandon ruin everything. Not like this. A knock on the door startled him, and his body stiffened. He knew it wasn't Isabella. She was out of town for the weekend, attending one of her many charity events. But this visitor was someone Tony knew well, someone he trusted. "Boss," a low voice came from the doorway. It was Vito, Tony's most loyal enforcer. His face was as cold as Tony's, but his eyes held a flicker of concern. "We've got a problem." Tony turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. "What problem?" Vito stepped inside, holding a phone in his hand. "It's Brandon. He's gone off the grid. We can't get a hold of him." Tony's face turned ashen. His mind raced. "Where is he?" "We don't know," Vito replied, his voice tense. "But there's been some talk. People are saying they've seen him near the docks. Alone. Tony's hand clenched into a fist. Get the crew ready. We're going to find him. And when we do, make sure he understands what happens when you cross me. Vito nodded and quickly left, but Tony remained by the balcony, staring into the night. A sense of finality hung in the air. The city of New York, in all its brilliance, had a way of hiding its darkest secrets behind its shiny skyscrapers and bustling streets. For Tony Russo, the night was still young, but his thoughts had already spiraled into a pit of anger and despair. Brandon's betrayal had set something dangerous in motion, something he couldn't stop. Tony paced across his penthouse, the weight of his decisions pressing heavily on his chest. The sleek, modern furniture, the polished floors, the view of the city lights. All of it felt hollow now, as though the world outside was indifferent to his inner turmoil. His empire was built on fear, power, and control, but now it was all on the verge of collapse. Vito's words kept echoing in his head. He's at the docks, alone. Tony knew the docks well, an industrial part of the city that felt like the forgotten edge of the world. It was where deals were made in shadows, where bodies disappeared without a trace. It was the perfect place for a man like Brandon to meet his end. But Tony's mind wasn't focused on the dock just yet. His thoughts raced to Isabella, his wife, the woman who had stood by him through everything, the one person who still believed in the man he pretended to be. What would she do if she knew? What would she say if she understood what had been happening behind her back? His gut twisted at the thought of losing her, and yet in his heart, he knew there was no choice. If he didn't silence Brandon, everything would unravel. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight as Tony drove through the empty streets of Manhattan, the sleek black car cutting through the city like a predator on the hunt. Vito sat beside him, his eyes scanning the road ahead. The tension in the car was palpable, and even the hum of the engine seemed too loud in the thick silence. "Boss," Vito said, breaking the quiet, "you sure about this? I know what he did, but maybe there's another way. We don't need to go to the docks. We can handle this without bloodshed." Tony's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Number, this ends tonight. I don't want anyone talking. He should have known better than to cross me." Vito glanced at Tony, his face set in grim determination. "Understood." They didn't speak again until the car reached the outskirts of the city. The docks loomed ahead, a vast, desolate expanse where rusted metal and abandoned shipping containers stood like silent sentinels in the night. The faint sound of waves lapping against the shore was the only noise that broke the silence as they pulled into a small lot near the water's edge. Tony parked the car in the shadows, the headlights cutting through the dark. "Stay here," he ordered Vito, his voice low and dangerous. "I'll handle this." Vito nodded but hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Just be careful, Tony. If this goes wrong, it could come back to haunt us." Tony's cold gaze never wavered. "It won't." He stepped out of the car and made his way down the narrow path leading to the docks. His boots echoed against the concrete, the sound amplifying in the eerie quiet. As he approached the edge of the water, he saw a shadowy figure standing near a shipping container, barely visible under the dim streetlights. It was Brandon. Brandon didn't turn around when Tony approached. He stood with his back to him, staring out over the water. The wind tugged at his jacket, and the faint smell of salt water mixed with the stench of oil and rust. He didn't look like the confident man Tony had once known. He looked small, vulnerable, as though he regretted everything that had led him here. "You shouldn't have done this, Brandon." Tony's voice was cold, his words slicing through the night air like a blade. Brandon flinched at the sound of Tony's voice, but he didn't move. "I had to, Tony. She deserves to know. I'm done being your secret. I'm not afraid of you anymore." Tony took a step closer, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "You think you're in control now? You think you can just walk away and everything will be fine? You've got no idea what you've done." Brandon turned to face him, his eyes dark with defiance. "I'm not afraid of you. Not anymore. You've built an empire on lies, Tony. You think you can control everything, everyone? Not me. Not anymore." For a moment, Tony saw something in Brandon's eyes, something that reminded him of the man he had fallen for. But that brief flicker of vulnerability was gone in an instant, replaced by cold, hard resolve. "I won't let you ruin everything I've worked for." Tony said, his voice low and menacing. You should have kept your mouth shut. You should have known better than to cross me. Brandon took a step back, his hands trembling. I won't be your puppet anymore, Tony. I won't be part of your lies. I've made my peace with this. Tony's breath came faster now, his heart pounding in his chest. You should have stayed away, Brandon. You should have known that this would be the end for you. Brandon's eyes widened, a flicker of fear crossing his face. He took another step back, but it was too late. Tony was already on him. In one swift motion, Tony grabbed Brandon by the throat, his fingers tightening with all the fury he'd been holding back. Brandon struggled, gasping for air, his hands clawing at Tony's arm, but it was no use. Tony's grip was unyielding. The world seemed to fade away as Tony's thoughts narrowed to one thing: survival. Brandon had made his choice. Now Tony had to make his. With one final squeeze, the life left Brandon's body, and his limp form slumped in Tony's arms. Tony stood there for a moment, panting heavily, his hands trembling from the adrenaline. The weight of what he had just done hung heavy in the air, but there was no turning back now. He had to protect what was his, no matter the cost. He dropped Brandon's body into the water, watching as it disappeared into the dark depths. The waves rippled briefly, then settled, as if the water had swallowed the truth whole. Tony returned to the car without saying a word to Vito. The enforcer didn't ask any questions. He knew better than to push Tony when he was like this. The two men drove back in silence, the city lights casting long shadows across the road. As they entered the penthouse once again, Tony walked straight to the window and looked out over the city. His empire was still intact, for now, but there was a cost to everything. The phone buzzed on the table, pulling Tony out of his thoughts. It was Isabella's number. Tony stared at the screen for a moment, then turned the phone face down. He would deal with her later. For now, there was only one thing left to do: make sure that Brandon Cole's death remained a secret. No one could ever know the truth. The next morning, the cold reality of the events from the night before started to settle into Tony's mind. The weight of Brandon's death lingered in the air, as though it had woven itself into the very fabric of his existence. Despite his efforts to bury the guilt and anger, there was a small, nagging voice at the back of his mind reminding him of the human cost of his decisions. But he couldn't afford to dwell on it. He had a wife to console, a life to protect, and an empire to maintain. Isabella, his beautiful, intelligent wife, was still unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface of their marriage. As far as she knew, everything was fine. Perfect even. Isabella Russo was the epitome of grace. Her long auburn hair cascaded down her back, and her sharp emerald eyes were the envy of many in New York's high society. She was the woman everyone admired, poised, charitable, and beautiful. She had married Tony years ago, a union that had long been seen as the epitome of power and status. But the truth was, Isabella had no idea what lurked in the shadows of their marriage. It was nearly noon when Isabella returned home. She had been away at a charity event all weekend, attending an art auction that raised millions for children's education. She had hardly spoken to Tony during the trip, caught up in the whirlwind of New York's elite social scene. But now, as she stepped into the penthouse, the stark emptiness of the place felt suffocating. "Tony," Isabella called out as she entered the foyer, her voice carrying softly through the spacious apartment. Tony stood near the window, his back to her, staring at the city below. He hadn't been able to sleep much, but he knew he had to maintain the facade of normalcy. As always, he masked his thoughts with a calm, collected exterior. "Isabella," he said, turning to face her, "how was the event?" She smiled warmly, but her eyes seemed distant. "It went well. We raised a lot of money for the kids. It's always rewarding, you know." She set her purse down on the side table and walked toward him, placing a soft kiss on his cheek. "I missed you. I thought you'd be asleep when I got home." Tony smiled tightly, trying to suppress the rising panic that clawed at him. "I've been up. Couldn't sleep. Just thinking." Isabella's gaze softened, noticing the slight change in his demeanor. "Are you all right, Tony? You seem off." He shrugged, forcing his smile to widen. "I'm fine. Just tired. You know how it is. But Isabella wasn't convinced. You sure? You've been acting strange the last few days, like something's bothering you. Tony quickly changed the subject, not wanting to discuss his internal turmoil. I'm just glad you're home. Did you get the art piece you wanted? She shook her head, chuckling lightly. Not this time. The bidding was insane, but it's all right. We'll find something else. The conversation lingered on trivial matters as Tony distracted her with talk of business and their upcoming social engagements. But beneath his words, his thoughts were already far away, consumed by the fear of what could come next. Brandon's death had to remain a secret. No one could ever know the truth, especially Isabella. Later, that evening, as the sky turned dark and the city lights illuminated the streets below, Isabella sat alone at the dining table, staring down at her phone. She had been trying to reach Brandon all afternoon, but her calls had gone unanswered. At first, she thought he was just busy, but as the hours passed, the sinking feeling in her gut grew. Something was wrong. She knew Brandon well enough to know that he would never ignore her calls unless there was a problem. Tony entered the room, dressed in a sharp suit, the same cold expression on his face. He had to attend a meeting with his associates, but he could sense the unease in Isabella's posture. Is everything all right? Tony asked, his voice low, masking the sharpness that was still hidden behind his words. Isabella looked up at him, her brows furrowed. I've been trying to reach Brandon all day. I haven't heard from him since last night. He's not answering my calls. It's not like him. Tony stiffened, but he forced a smile, walking across the room to stand beside her. I'm sure he's fine. Maybe he's just busy. You know how he gets sometimes. Isabella wasn't convinced. Tony, something doesn't feel right. He was supposed to meet me today, and now he's not picking up. Tony's expression remained calm, but inside the panic was starting to rise. I'll have someone check on him. Don't worry, it's probably nothing. Hours passed, and Tony's worst fear began to materialize. Vito had called him earlier, confirming that Brandon's body had been found, dumped at the docks like a discarded piece of trash. It was clear that the death was no accident. Tony had been careful, but now as the hours went by and the news of Brandon's disappearance began to circulate, Tony realized that the walls were closing in faster than he had anticipated. But he couldn't let Isabella find out, not yet. The next morning, Tony was sitting in his office reviewing documents when his phone buzzed. It was Vito again. He picked it up immediately. Boss, we've got a problem. Tony's blood ran cold. What is it? The police are starting to ask questions. They found Brandon's body. No sign of a struggle, no obvious cause of death. But there's one thing. They're talking to people from the docks. They're asking about anyone who might have seen something. Tony's heart raced. Get ahead of it. Make sure no one talks. I want every person at the docks to keep their mouth shut. Do you understand? Vito's voice was grim. Got it. We'll handle it. But there's more. The police are going to want to talk to you, Tony. They're already looking into Brandon's connections. Tony's mind raced as he tried to process the situation. It was only a matter of time before the police came knocking. And when they did, he knew it would all unravel. Meanwhile, Isabella was still reeling from the news of Brandon's disappearance. She spent the entire day trying to get in touch with the police, but they were tight-lipped about the investigation. The feeling of dread weighed heavily on her. Something was wrong. Brandon was more than just a friend to her. He was someone she trusted deeply, someone who knew things about her life that no one else did. As the evening approached, Isabella sat alone in the living room, staring at a photograph of herself and Brandon. She had always known that there was more to his relationship with Tony than met the eye, but she never dared to question it. The thought of their affair, of Tony's betrayal, was too much to bear. But now as she looked at the photo, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being pulled into something much darker than she could ever imagine. The whispers in her mind were growing louder, and she couldn't ignore them anymore. Isabella knew something had to be done. She had to find the truth, and she would stop at nothing to uncover it. Little did she know, Tony was already preparing for the storm that was about to hit. The investigator would soon be knocking on their door, and Tony Russo was ready to do whatever it took to protect his secrets. Detective Michael Hayes was not the type to be easily swayed by the glitz and glamour of the city. In his 15 years on the force, he had seen it all. Rich men with dark secrets, powerful families with blood on their hands, and high-profile cases that quickly turned into unsolvable mysteries. But something about the case of Brandon Cole was different. There was a certain heaviness in the air, a feeling that this was more than just a typical murder. This was personal. The call had come in the night before. A body was found at the docks, dumped like trash, with no obvious cause of death. No witnesses, no surveillance footage. Just a man dead in the water, his life taken before anyone could even question why. Hayes knew that this wasn't just some petty crime. It was too clean, too calculated. Whoever had done this had experience in handling people, in getting rid of them without leaving a trace. But what caught Hayes's attention was the connection to Tony Russo. The Russo name was synonymous with power in New York. Tony was a respected businessman with ties to some of the city's most dangerous people. The more Hayes dug, the more he began to suspect that Tony Russo's empire wasn't built on just legitimate businesses. It was built on blood. It was a cool Tuesday morning when Hayes entered the Russo family's penthouse. The building stood tall, its reflective glass windows mirroring the bustling streets below. From the outside, it looked pristine, untouchable. But Hayes knew better. Behind the shiny facade, there were secrets lurking in every corner. As he stepped into the elevator, the weight of the investigation bore down on him. He wasn't a rookie anymore. He had handled high-profile cases before, but something about this one felt personal. Maybe it was because of the way the case had been handled so carefully. Or maybe it was because Brandon's body had been found just a few miles from Tony Russo's empire. When the elevator doors opened, Hayes stepped into the penthouse lobby. The marble floors glistened, and the lavish decor made it clear that money wasn't an issue for the Russo family. The woman who greeted him was as poised and immaculate as the home itself, Isabella Russo. "Detective Hayes," she greeted him with a polite smile. "Thank you for coming." Her grace and charm didn't fool Hayes. He had dealt with enough people in his career to know that appearances could be deceiving. He extended his hand, shaking hers firmly. "Mrs. Russo, I wish it were under better circumstances. I'm here to ask you a few questions about your late associate, Brandon Cole." Isabella's smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "Of course. Please come in." She led him through the expansive living room, offering him a seat on the plush sofa. Hayes took a moment to observe the room. Everything was meticulously arranged, like a display of wealth and status. But there was a coldness to the space, a sense of emptiness. It was as if the luxury itself was a shield, concealing something far darker beneath the surface. "So what can you tell me about Brandon?" Hayes asked, sitting down across from her. Isabella hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her glass. "Brandon was, a close friend. He had been working with Tony and me for years. He was very important to us." "Important enough to make enemies?" Hayes asked, his eyes narrowing. "Did he have any issues with anyone recently?" Isabella's eyes flickered for a moment, but she quickly composed herself. "Brandon was always involved in the business world. High-profile people, powerful connections. It's not uncommon for someone in his position to step on the wrong toes, but I don't know of any specific threats." Hayes studied her carefully. She was hiding something. He could feel it, but he couldn't push too hard just yet. "And what about your husband, Tony Russo? How has he been handling the situation?" Isabella's expression softened, but there was an edge to it. "Tony's been worried, of course. He's trying to keep everything under control. He's been very busy with the company, dealing with the aftermath." "Of course," Hayes replied, his voice neutral. He could tell she wasn't being entirely forthcoming, but Hayes knew better than to press too hard in the first conversation. He needed to be subtle, build rapport before diving deeper. He continued, "Did Brandon ever mention anything about someone threatening him? Any unusual behavior or conversations?" Isabella shook her head. "Number, not that I can remember. He was a professional, always careful about keeping things private. But there were times when he was distracted. A little distant, maybe. I just thought it was the pressure of the work." That's it, Hayes thought. He had struck something. "You mentioned pressure. What kind of pressure? Work-related?" She paused, looking down at her hands. "I don't know. I think he and Tony had disagreements. Brandon wanted to take some of his own initiatives, But Tony wasn't always on board with them. I'm sure that didn't help things. Hayes filed that away. Tony Russo had a reputation for being controlling, a man who didn't share power easily. But this didn't feel like a simple professional disagreement. There was something more at play. You said Brandon was important to you, Hayes pressed gently. Was he just a business partner, or was there something else? Isabella froze. For a brief moment, Hayes could see the flicker of something, guilt, fear, or perhaps regret, pass over her face. But she quickly masked it with a tight-lipped smile. Brandon was a friend, detective, she said firmly. Nothing more. Hayes didn't believe her, but he didn't push further. He knew that the truth would come out, piece by piece. The lies always crumbled eventually. As he left the penthouse and stepped back into the elevator, Hayes couldn't shake the feeling that he had only scratched the surface. Isabella had been evasive, but not entirely dishonest. He sensed that she was trying to protect something, or someone. He needed more. He needed to dig deeper into Tony Russo's world. The next step was clear. Hayes needed to speak with Tony Russo himself. If Brandon's death was connected to the Russo family, then Tony was the key to everything. But Hayes knew this wouldn't be easy. Tony Russo was a dangerous man, and getting too close to him could cost him more than just the case. It could cost him his career, or worse, his life. Meanwhile, Tony was already aware that the investigation was heating up. He had anticipated that the police would eventually come knocking, but he hadn't expected it to happen so soon. He had spent the entire morning reviewing his alibis, making sure his tracks were covered. The police would find no evidence linking him to Brandon's death, but Tony wasn't fooling himself. Hayes was smart. Hayes would keep digging, and when he did, Tony would need to be ready. For now, though, Tony's thoughts were consumed with one thing: Isabella. She had asked questions, too many questions, and sooner or later she would find out the truth about him and Brandon. The affair, the betrayal, it would all come crashing down. He couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not when everything he had worked for was at stake. As Tony prepared for the inevitable confrontation with Hayes, he knew one thing. No one could find out what happened to Brandon Cole. Not Isabella, not the police, not anyone. Because if they did, it would mean the end of everything. And Tony Russo would never allow that. The following week was one of tension. Detective Michael Hayes was relentless. Every moment he wasn't spent reviewing files or questioning witnesses was spent preparing for his next move. As the investigation unfolded, he uncovered more and more about the Russo family, each new discovery leading him closer to the truth. Hayes knew that Tony Russo was hiding something. It was too convenient, the way Brandon's body had been disposed of, like someone trying to erase all traces of a crime. The careful way Tony carried himself, smooth, polished, like a man who had lived his life behind layers of armor, was a red flag. But Tony had been smart, covering his tracks meticulously. It would take more than a few interviews and witness statements to break him. Meanwhile, Isabella had been restless. The nagging questions she'd had about Tony and Brandon's relationship were getting harder to ignore. The subtle tension between them had been present for months, but now it felt suffocating. She couldn't shake the suspicion that there was more to Brandon's death than what Tony had told her. Despite Tony's attempts to reassure her, Isabella's mind wouldn't let go of the unease. In the privacy of her study, Isabella sat down to go through the paperwork for the charity event she had attended. It was supposed to be a distraction, something to take her mind off of the mess her life had become. But as she leafed through the papers, her eyes landed on the contact details for Brandon's assistant, a young woman named Mia. Mia had worked closely with Brandon for years, organizing his meetings, overseeing his schedule. If anyone knew about his recent dealings, it would be her. Isabella knew she had to speak to her. Picking up her phone, Isabella dialed the number. Mia answered quickly, her voice tense. "Mrs. Russo?" "Yes, it's Isabella. I need to ask you a few questions about Brandon," Isabella said, trying to keep her voice calm despite the churning in her stomach. There was a slight pause on the other end of the line before Mia responded. "Of course, Mrs. Russo. What do you need?" Isabella took a deep breath. "I need to know if there's anything unusual about Brandon's recent behavior. Did he mention anything? Anything at all that seemed out of place?" Mia hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Mrs. Russo, I don't want to cause any trouble, But there were things. Brandon and Mr. Russo, they didn't always get along. Brandon had his own plans. He didn't want to stay in Tony's shadow forever. Isabella's heart pounded. What plans? What was he trying to do? Mia's voice faltered, but she continued. I'm not sure exactly, but he had mentioned wanting to move on from his work with the company. He talked about starting his own venture, something that didn't involve Mr. Russo. He wasn't happy, and recently he'd started meeting with people who weren't exactly on the up and up. He was nervous, Mrs. Russo. He'd been getting calls late at night, speaking in hushed tones. Isabella's blood ran cold. Brandon had been planning to leave Tony. That explained the tension. It explained why he'd been avoiding her calls, and it explained why he had been so afraid. She needed to know more. Did he say who he was meeting with? Isabella pressed. Mia paused. He didn't tell me much, just that it was dangerous. He said it was something that could change everything, but he didn't want me involved. I, I wish I could tell you more, Mrs. Russo, but I'm afraid. Isabella's mind raced. Mia, where did he go the night he... There was a sharp knock on the door, cutting off her sentence. Isabella's heart skipped a beat. She quickly hung up the phone and rushed to answer. It was Tony. Is everything all right? He asked, his voice smooth but with a slight edge. Isabella stood in the doorway, her eyes narrowed. I'm fine. I was talking to Mia. Tony's gaze hardened. Isabella, I told you not to get involved in this. I'll handle it. This is a dangerous situation. You don't need to know more than you already do. But I do need to know more, Tony, Isabella said, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. Brandon, he wasn't just some employee to you, was he? You had more than a business relationship. Tony's expression faltered for a brief second, just enough for Isabella to see the raw panic beneath the surface. But then he recovered, his face turning cold again. You're imagining things, Isabella. Brandon was a trusted colleague. That's all? Isabella shook her head, her voice trembling with the rising fury she could no longer suppress. I don't believe you. I know you were seeing him. I know you were having an affair with him, Tony. And now he's dead, and you're trying to cover it up. You're lying to me. The words hit Tony like a punch to the gut. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just stared at her, trying to process the truth of what she had just said. But before he could respond, the sound of a car screeching to a halt outside shattered the tension between them. Both of them turned to the window. Isabella's eyes widened in horror as she saw Detective Hayes's car pull up to the curb. He was here. The moment she had feared had arrived. Isabella, stay here, Tony ordered, his voice sharp. Do not speak to him. Do not say anything. But Isabella's mind was already made up. She couldn't stay silent any longer. Not now. Not when everything was falling apart. As Detective Hayes approached the door, he could sense the tension in the air. He had been investigating Tony Russo for days, and everything pointed to him being involved in Brandon's death. But he needed something concrete, something that would finally break the case wide open. He rang the doorbell. Isabella opened the door, her face pale but determined. Detective Hayes, what can I do for you? Hayes took a moment to study her. There was something in her eyes, a mix of fear and resolve. She knew more than she was letting on. He could feel it, but there was no time to waste. I need to ask you a few more questions, Mrs. Russo, Hayes said, his tone professional but firm. It's about your late associate, Brandon Cole. We've uncovered some new evidence that suggests there may have been more going on than just a simple business relationship. Isabella hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced at Tony, who stood behind her, his face unreadable. Of course, she said, stepping aside to let Hayes enter. The moment the door closed behind them, Isabella knew she had reached a crossroads. The lies, the secrets, the affair, it was all about to come to light. Tony's empire, built on fear and manipulation, was about to crumble. And as the investigator prepared to ask his questions, Isabella knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back now. Whatever happened next would change everything. As Detective Hayes sat across from them, his eyes sharp and calculating, he spoke the words that would ultimately set the stage for the truth to be revealed. I know what happened to Brandon Cole, Hayes said, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. And I'm going to find out who killed him. I just hope it's not too late to save anyone else from the same fate. The room fell silent after Detective Hayes' words hung in the air. Isabella's hands trembled, but she forced herself to remain composed. She had come this far. She couldn't back out now. She needed to know the truth, even if it meant everything she had built with Tony would come crashing down. Tony, on the other hand, remained as stone-faced as ever. His lips were pressed into a tight line, his hands folded neatly in front of him. But Hayes could see the subtle tension in his posture, the slight stiffness in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched whenever Isabella shifted in her seat. Tony was on edge, and Hayes knew he had struck a nerve. Isabella glanced over at Tony, her expression unreadable. Detective Hayes, I understand you're doing your job, but we've already told you everything we know about Brandon. I don't see how any further questions will help. Hayes didn't flinch. Mrs. Russo, I believe you're hiding something. There's a lot more to Brandon's death than what you've been telling me. I'm not here to make accusations, but the evidence I've gathered suggests there was more to your relationship with Brandon than just business. Tony's eyes narrowed. He leaned forward, his voice cold and commanding. Detective, you've been warned to stay out of this. My wife and I are grieving the loss of someone who was close to us. If you don't have anything new to add to this case, then I suggest you leave. But Hayes wasn't intimidated. He had been in situations like this before, where people in power tried to shut him down, tried to control the narrative. The key was to remain calm, to press just a little harder, to wait for the right moment. He didn't need to rush. Not yet. He had his leverage. There's a pattern here, Mr. Russo, Hayes said, his voice measured. Brandon had been trying to get out of your shadow. He was in too deep, but he was looking for a way out. And from what I've gathered, you didn't like that. You didn't want to lose control. Tony's gaze flickered for a split second, but he quickly regained his composure. That's absurd. Brandon knew the risks of being involved with people like us. He knew what he was getting into. If he had any doubts, he shouldn't have been involved in the first place. Hayes leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Tony's. And you think that's why he's dead? You think he got himself killed because he was involved with you? Or maybe there's something else going on here. Maybe you're trying to cover up something much bigger. Isabella looked between the two men, her mind racing. Hayes was getting too close to the truth. She could feel it. She had already uncovered so much, and now with Hayes pressing for answers, she realized that there was only one way out, one way to finally end this. I think that's enough, Detective, Isabella said suddenly, her voice more forceful than she intended. She stood up from her seat, her legs shaking slightly. I've told you everything I know. Now, if you'll excuse us, my husband and I need some time alone. Hayes didn't move, not yet. He had to be careful. If he pressed too hard, they might shut down completely. But he couldn't let this slip. He had one final question, one last piece of the puzzle he needed to fit together. There's one thing I still don't understand, Hayes said, his voice soft but carrying an edge. You said Brandon was important to you. But why? Was it just business? Or was there something more? Were you and Brandon involved in something more personal? The air in the room shifted. Tony's jaw tightened, and Isabella's face went pale. For a moment, there was nothing but the silence between them, the kind of silence that only comes when a lie has been exposed. Tony stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Detective, Tony said, his voice low and dangerous. You're making a mistake. I suggest you leave now, before you regret this. But Isabella wasn't looking at Tony. Her eyes were fixed on Hayes, and for the first time since he had entered the room, she spoke again, her voice trembling. Tony, he didn't mean to hurt anyone, Isabella said softly, almost as if speaking to herself. It was supposed to be over. But Brandon, he knew too much. He wanted to leave, but he threatened to tell you everything. The words hung in the air like a heavy storm cloud, and for the first time Hayes saw it, the truth, raw and unvarnished. Isabella was breaking. She was admitting it. She was finally acknowledging that there was something more, something dark, something that had led to Brandon's death. Tony's face twisted in fury. Isabella, don't you dare! But Isabella continued, her voice growing steadier with each word. I didn't know what to do. Brandon knew about us, about me and him. I thought we could just keep it secret, but he didn't want to. He said he was going to expose everything. He was going to ruin everything, our lives, our family. Tony, he didn't have a choice. Tony lunged forward, grabbing Isabella by the shoulders. His grip was hard, almost painfully tight. You shut your mouth, Isabella. Do you hear me? You can't say anything more. I won't let you destroy this family. But it was too late. The words had been said. The dam had broken. Tony Russo's empire was beginning to crumble, piece by piece. Hayes remained still, watching the scene unfold. He had the confession he needed, the key to the mystery. Brandon hadn't been just another employee. He had been Tony Russo's lover, someone who had crossed a line that Tony was not willing to let anyone expose. Brandon had become a liability, and in the world Tony lived in, there was only one way to deal with liabilities. And now Isabella had confirmed it. Tony Russo had killed Brandon, and in doing so, had sealed his own fate. The following day, Hayes returned to the precinct with the crucial evidence he had gathered. As he sifted through the files, something in him felt different. It wasn't just another case, it was something personal. Tony Russo had become too comfortable, too arrogant in his power. He thought he could get away with murder, but Hayes would make sure he didn't. Back at the Russo penthouse, Tony had not yet spoken to Isabella since their argument. His mind was a blur of rage and frustration. He had worked his entire life to build an empire, and now it was all unraveling because of one mistake, a mistake that could cost him everything. Isabella sat in the living room, staring out the window. She had said too much, but she knew that her confession was inevitable. It wasn't just about Brandon anymore. It was about her life, her future. She had been living in the shadow of Tony's darkness for so long, but now she had to decide what she would do with the truth. Would she protect her husband as she had always done? Or would she stand up for herself for the first time in years and bring him down? The answer was unclear, but one thing was certain. The web of lies that Tony had woven was about to unravel completely, and when it did, nothing would ever be the same again. As Detective Hayes prepared to take the next step in his investigation, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the verge of something monumental. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and he knew that Tony Russo's world was about to come crashing down. And when that happened, the truth would be exposed in all its brutal, bloody glory. The day of reckoning had arrived. Detective Hayes stood outside the towering gates of the Russo estate, the weight of the investigation heavy on his chest. After days of interviews, hidden messages, and strained conversations, everything was coming to a head. The pieces of the puzzle were no longer scattered. They were fitting together, revealing the horrific truth about Brandon Cole's death. Hayes knew this wasn't just about solving a murder. It was about exposing the dark underbelly of a criminal empire, one built on violence, secrecy, and betrayal. And at the heart of it all was Tony Russo, a man with the power to destroy lives but now standing on the brink of losing everything. Inside the penthouse, Tony Russo was pacing. His mind was racing, the events of the past few days swirling in his head like a storm. He hadn't slept in days, too consumed by the fear of being caught, of losing his empire, his wife, everything. His hands shook as he ran them through his hair. It was as though the walls were closing in on him, and there was nowhere left to run. Isabella had been silent since the confession. She hadn't said a word to him since their argument. Her eyes were hollow, like she had already made up her mind about what she would do. The tension in the room was palpable, like an electric charge hanging in the air, ready to explode. Tony's thoughts drifted back to Brandon, to the days leading up to his death. How things had gone from secret meetings to blackmail. How the fear of losing control had driven him to a place he never imagined. He had never meant to kill Brandon, at least not in the way it had happened. But when Brandon threatened to go public with their affair, Tony had snapped. A knock on the door pulled him out of his thoughts. It was loud, sharp, demanding. Without thinking, he stood and walked toward the door, his heart thumping in his chest. Isabella watched him silently from the sofa, her gaze distant, unfocused. When he opened the door, standing on the threshold was Detective Hayes, his face calm but resolute. Behind him were two uniformed officers, their expressions unreadable. Mr. Russo, I need you to come with us, Hayes said, his voice firm, but not unkind. Tony's breath caught in his throat. He had known this day would